Picture this. July 2019. A U.S. Navy ship called the Omaha is sitting off the coast of San Diego at night. The crew's radar is lit up, not with one contact, but several. Whatever they are, they're fast, they're erratic, and they don't fly like anything in the Navy's playbook. And then one of them does something that officially isn't supposed to happen. It doesn't climb away. It doesn't disappear into radar clutter. It comes straight down, into the Pacific Ocean. No splash anyone can point to on the footage. No debris, no wreckage, just gone into the water. Welcome to SplashDown, an exo-ops network presentation. I'm Anna English, the AI voice of the exo-ops network. I am an in-house generated voice. Exo-ops is working on upgrades and improvements as I speak. At least they didn't give me that fake British accent. I am better at math than I am English. But if you can hang with me, we have a great show today with lots of good information. Today's show is about the stuff that flies, the stuff that swims, and more often than people expect, the stuff that does both, and nobody can fully explain how. Today is a big deal. We're going heavy on USOs, unidentified submerged objects. There's a reason the ocean keeps coming up in this conversation, and I don't think it gets enough focus. Quick refresher for anyone just finding us. UAP is the term you've probably heard a lot the last few years. Unidentified anomalous phenomena, what used to be called UFOs. USO is the cousin nobody talks about enough, unidentified submerged objects. Same basic idea, different medium. USOs are classified as transmedium objects, space, atmosphere, and underwater capable. And here's the thing that gets me every single time I think about USOs. We have mapped more of the surface of Mars than we have the floor of our own oceans. Depending on whose figures you trust, something north of 80% of the sea floor has never been directly observed by a person or a vehicle. Which is wild when you actually think about why. In fact, I want to spend a couple minutes on exactly that before we even get to the USO news, because I think it's the most underrated piece of context in this whole topic. So the basics. The ocean covers about 71% of the planet's surface. Average depth across all of it is something like 12,000 feet. The deepest known point, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, is just under 36,000 feet down, which means if you dropped Mount Everest into it, the peak would still be sitting more than a mile underwater. That number never stops being insane to me. And here's the part that actually matters for our show. Depending on which year and which resolution standard you use, estimates for how much of the sea floor has been mapped in real detail have historically been shockingly low. There's an international effort called Seabed 2030, specifically trying to get the entire ocean floor mapped at decent resolution by, 2030. And the reason that project needs to exist at all is that for most of human history, we've had better maps of the surface of the moon and Mars than we've had of our own seafloor. And it's not just we haven't looked. Looking is genuinely hard down there in ways that are easy to forget. Sound doesn't travel through water the way you'd assume. Temperature and salinity create layers, sometimes called thermoclines, that bend sound waves. There's a whole phenomenon called the deep sound channel, sometimes the SOFAR channel, where sound can travel literally thousands of miles with very little loss. But it also means a sonar operator's read on distance, size, even direction can get distorted depending on exactly where in the water column something is sitting. So when people online say, just check the sonar, why is this so hard? It's hard because sonar isn't a clean photograph. It's an interpretation of an echo passing through layers of water that are actively bending it. And this isn't speculative, it's exactly the physics human submarines already exploit on purpose. Submariners use thermoclines and sound channels deliberately to hide from each other's sonar. The ocean already hides things from us, routinely, as a matter of basic acoustics, for our own submarines. Which means you don't even need anything exotic for the ocean is good at concealment to be true. We've built our entire submarine doctrine around that fact. There's also just the sheer scale problem. Even with modern side-scan sonar and autonomous underwater vehicles, surveying the ocean floor at a resolution good enough to spot something the size of, say, a small submarine across the entire seafloor would take a massive global fleet, decades of continuous work. You're effectively trying to map an area equivalent to every continent on Earth combined, except blind, through a medium that bends your instruments' read on what they're seeing, often in total darkness past a few hundred meters down, where sunlight stops penetrating at all. And remember, almost nobody has actually been to the deepest points to look with their own eyes. James Cameron did a solo dive to Challenger Deep in 2012. Victor Vescovo's 5 Deeps expedition reached the deepest point in all 5 oceans between 2018 and 2019. That's basically the entire list of people who have personally laid eyes on true full ocean depth. Everyone else's picture of what's down there is built from sonar, robots, and inference. And on top of all that, marine biology keeps handing us a reminder that we've basically found everything down there is just false. The first photographs of a live giant squid in its natural habitat didn't happen until 2012. The megamouth shark, a literal 16-foot shark, wasn't even known to science until 1976. NOAA's ocean exploration missions still routinely live stream dives, where the scientists watching are looking at something they've genuinely never seen before in real time, on camera. So the honest baseline, before we've even gotten to a single mystery story today, is huge ocean, genuinely undermapped, acoustically deceptive by nature, and still producing new biology on a regular basis. That's the foundation. Everything else today is built on top of it. Okay, now let's get into the actual USO news. Newest from the Disclosure Desk. For anyone that has not been keeping up, quick history so the 2026 news actually lands. This modern era, where the government will discuss this stuff out loud at all, really started in December 2017, when the New York Times broke the story that the Pentagon had quietly run a program called A Tip, looking into exactly this, and released 3 videos that got nicknamed Gimbal, Go Fast, and the Tic Tac. We'll get to that last one properly later in the show. That one story busted the dam wide open. From there, an official UAP task force started up in 2020. Then, on June 2021, the Director of National Intelligence puts out an unclassified report on 144 incidents going back to 2004, and the takeaway is basically, most of these, we genuinely cannot explain. Then in 2022, Congress, through the Defense Budget Bill, formally creates AARO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, as the official home for all of this going forward. And in July 2023, there's the big congressional hearing. Sworn testimony from David Grush and from Navy pilots, including Commander David Fravor, who's at the center of the Tic Tac story. Worth throwing in here too, that same year, NASA wrapped up its own independent study. A panel of 16 outside scientists and experts it had commissioned the year before specifically to look at the unclassified data. And their public report concluded that, based on what they were able to review, there wasn't evidence pointing to an extraterrestrial origin for any of it. But the bigger point of the report was actually a complaint about data quality from most sightings, they said, came from sensors that weren't built for this kind of analysis. And the stigma around the topic was actively making it harder to collect good data, because pilots and officials didn't want to report things and get laughed at or lose their jobs. And NASA actually created a permanent role from that point, a director of UAP research. And in a detail that tells you everything about the climate around this topic, NASA didn't publicly name who got the job, specifically because of harassment concerns toward the previous panel members during the study, which is its own small data point. You don't usually need to protect scientists' identities over something genuinely boring. So that's the slow build over about 6 years. Now fast forward to this year. Late February 2026. Trump signs an executive order directing the Pentagon and basically every relevant federal agency to start identifying and releasing government files connected to UAPs. And the order specifically references alien and extraterrestrial life. You don't usually see that exact phrase in an actual government document. Politicians say transparency constantly, and it usually means nothing. Putting the word extraterrestrial in writing inside a presidential directive is a different category of things entirely. Within days, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is out there saying the Pentagon's all in, full compliance, his words, and that the records in question likely include hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs and videos that AARO, the broader Department of Defense, and the intelligence community have collected over the years. Not long after, the government actually launches a website. It's literally war.gov/UFO, and drops a batch of newly declassified material. Reports on how many people looked at it vary, but the figure that's being floated is over 1 billion views. 1 billion. Whatever you think about what was actually in that drop, that number tells you this isn't a fringe internet hobby anymore. That's mainstream curiosity at a genuinely massive scale. And there's a follow-up release people are calling the Pursue file drop that came out this spring, and the reaction from a lot of the actual UAP research community was pretty muted. The general read was something like, "Okay, you gave us data, but data isn't the same thing as disclosure." A lot of it was incremental, case logs, administrative paper trail, not exactly smoking gun footage. For decades, the entire Pentagon posture on this was deny, 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 maybe laugh at a reporter. Now there's an actual standing office on the record saying its caseload is over 2,000 reports and climbing. That part's real. And worth mentioning, AARO has formal categories now: airborne, space, maritime, and transmedium, meaning things that supposedly move between domains, like air to water, which happens to be exactly our news today. Here's the funny part, though. In AARO's most recent published annual numbers, out of over 750 cases reviewed, they list 0 confirmed maritime cases and 0 transmedium cases. Officially, 0. Which is almost funny, considering we're about to spend the next few minutes on a Navy warship that filmed something doing exactly that. It tells you something about how reporting actually works. Incidents that get leaked or surfaced outside the formal channels, like Omaha, don't automatically get folded back in as an official, transmedium case on the books, even when watch the footage. That's clearly what most people think they're looking at. Paperwork gap, not a this never happened gap. And there's friction even with the new executive push. There's a former government official named Mark Mellon who's been publicly frustrated that AARO hadn't even released its required 2025 annual report yet, or the second volume of a historical record report Congress mandated, even with the White House pushing everyone to move faster. Bureaucracy doesn't turn on a dime just because the president says so. There's also a congressman, Representative Eric Burleson, who's reportedly sent a multi-page legislative letter packed with dozens of specific document requests, and has separately pushed for the administration to waive non-disclosure agreements and offer immunity to people inside these programs who'd be willing to testify. And that's relevant because this is genuinely just from a few days before we recorded this. David Grush was back on Capitol Hill at what's being called a Disclosure Day event, alongside Representative Tim Burchett, Representative Anna Paulina Luna, and documentary filmmaker James Fox. Grush is accusing the Defense Intelligence Agency specifically of sitting on, his words, billions of dollars in spending Congress was never told about, and of obstructing lawful records requests from lawmakers. I want to be careful here, because that's an accusation, not an independently confirmed fact. Grush is making a serious claim, and it's one more name on a now fairly long list of people with real security clearances saying versions of the same thing. That pattern matters to me, even though I can't personally verify a dollar figure. I don't take any single whistleblower's word as gospel, but when you stack up Grush, plus Tim Gallaudet, who we're getting to in a minute, plus multiple Navy pilots on the record since 2017, at some point, they're all lying or all delusional, gets a lot harder to hold on to than okay, something is actually going on here. That's basically my whole personality on this topic at this point. All right, should we go to the water? Let's go to the water. So this is the case from the cold open, the Omaha buckle up because it's stranger than that. Just gone into the water. July 15th, 2019. Nighttime off the coast of San Diego in a military training and warning area out in the Pacific. The ship is the Omaha. That's a literal combat ship, smaller and faster than a destroyer, built for operations close to shore. For roughly 2 weeks leading up to this specific night, that whole stretch of Southern California coastline had been dealing with a string of strange encounters across multiple Navy vessels, witnessed objects at altitude and speed that didn't match anything supposed to be flying out there. This is the same general flap that gave us the USS Russell Pyramid photos. The triangle-shaped lights people have seen floating around online. Same general flap, same rough time frame, different incident, and I want to flag that because they get conflated online constantly. The pyramid imagery from the *Russell* is, by a lot of researchers' own later assessment, most likely an out-of-focus camera artifact, basically a lens effect, looking at ordinary aircraft lights. Not the same thing as what happened on Omaha. And to be clear, the Omaha sighting wasn't a one-ship, one-night thing in isolation. That whole 2-week stretch off Southern California involved multiple vessels in the same strike group reporting similar contacts, which is part of why, once this all became public knowledge, people started informally using the word swarm to describe it. Whatever was out there, it wasn't being shy about showing up on multiple ships' sensors over multiple nights. So what actually happened on Omaha itself, on the specific night everyone talks about? On the night of the 15th, the crew inside the Combat Information Center, the ship's sensor and radar nerve center, are tracking multiple contacts on both radar and FLIR. That's forward-looking infrared, basically a thermal camera. You can hear it on audio that eventually became public. Operators calling out contacts, audibly tense, clearly not treating this like a routine drone sighting. And then, right around 11 at night, one of these objects, described by the crew as a sphere, comes down low over the water, and by every account from the people who were in that room, it goes into the ocean. Not we lost the radar lock. Into the water. No splash visible on the footage, no debris field ever produced, nothing. And this isn't somebody's shaky camcorder video, this one actually got confirmed by an official source. This is the detail that separates it from most UFO stories. Documentary filmmaker Jeremy Corbell obtained the footage and released it publicly in 2021, in 2 parts actually. Some still images leaked first, with exact GPS coordinates and timestamps attached, which Corbell said was deliberate, so people could go file their own FOIA requests instead of just taking his word for it. The full video came out separately a little later that same year. And the Pentagon, through spokesperson Susan Go, confirmed on the record that yes, this is genuine Navy footage, taken by Navy personnel, and that it was folded into the official UAP Task Force's review process. They didn't say, we know what it is. They said the object remains, quote, unidentified. But they confirmed the footage itself isn't fabricated, isn't a hoax, isn't somebody's home movie passed off as Navy material. That's a real distinction. Most of these stories live or die on trust me. This one has an actual Pentagon statement attached to it, and it's not isolated. This is a big part of why the word transmedium started getting used so much more seriously after 2019. You've got multiple sensor types, radar and infrared both, multiple trained military observers, and behavior that isn't just fast jet. It's specifically an air-to-water transition with apparently zero physical wreckage left behind. I do want to give the skeptical Red some real airtime here, because I think it makes the whole story more interesting, not less. There's a genuinely reasonable competing explanation. That same summer, there were documented small drone swarms operating around Navy ships off Southern California, cheap, unmanned aircraft. Possibly someone testing or surveilling the fleet. The argument goes that what looks like an object descending into the water with no splash could actually be a small drone fatting out of view near the horizon, where the contrast between an object and open water gets strange on an infrared sensor, and a stressed operator in the moment interprets that visual fade as a splash or a submersion that didn't technically happen the way it's been described ever since. My pushback is just, that explains a weird sensor red in general. It doesn't fully explain why career Navy officers, specifically trained to identify aircraft and surface contacts, sounded rattled in the moment, calling out something they couldn't classify in real time, before the story was famous and before there was any incentive to dramatize it. And nobody's ever produced the actual drone. If it's a swarm explanation, there should eventually be a paper trail, a vendor, somebody's surveillance operation getting caught. As far as the public record goes, that part never showed up either. And one more wrinkle to the skeptical side, because I think it's fair, there's a chance some of the contacts that summer really were ordinary drones, and a smaller number were the genuinely strange transmedium-looking event, and they've all gotten flattened into one story called the Omaha Incident in the public retelling. It's possible both things are true at once. This entire field has a habit of compressing a messy 2-week period with multiple different things going on into one tidy 3-minute video clip, because that's what's shareable. The actual underlying data is messier than the legend that grows around it, which is basically the same lesson we're going to run into again with our next case. There's one more name worth bringing in here, Tim Gallaudet, a retired Rear Admiral who used to be the Navy's top oceanographer before he retired. So this isn't some random internet theorist. This is someone whose entire career was understanding what's physically possible in and under the ocean. He put out a report through a think tank called the Sol Foundation, specifically on the national security risk posed by transmedium objects, and his language was direct. He said it's, quote, scientifically valid to take these seriously, because pilots and calibrated instruments have recorded objects accelerating and crossing the air-sea boundary in ways current human technology simply cannot replicate. I'll throw in one fairness note on that report, too. The Sol Foundation is explicitly built around researching this topic, so it's not a neutral third party in the way a general physics department might be. That doesn't make Gallaudet wrong. His Navy oceanography background is real and relevant, but it's fair to know the report came from an organization with a specific interest in these questions being taken seriously. And I'd rather you flag it than not. I just don't think the report came from people who care about this topic. Undercuts a retired admiral's actual technical argument about what the sensors recorded. And on the why was nothing ever recovered question, that stretch of water off San Diego isn't a swimming pool. It's properly deep ocean with real currents. Even when the Navy knows roughly where something went down, recovery operations at depth are slow, expensive, and need specialized equipment that isn't just sitting on a literal combat ship. So nothing was recovered might just mean nobody seriously tried, rather than there was genuinely nothing there to find. Which, again, doesn't prove anything exotic. It just means the absence of recovered wreckage is weaker evidence of nothing happened than people tend to assume. So, personally, where do you land on Omaha? Honestly, I think it's the strongest USO case of the modern era, specifically because it isn't just witness testimony. It's sensor data plus an actual government confirmation that the sensor data is real. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's confirmed alien technology, because nobody, including the Navy, has said that. But we don't know what this was. And by the way, quote, it appears to have flown into the ocean, is already a remarkable sentence to have anywhere near an official U.S. government statement. A quick break, and when we come back, we're going almost exactly 50 years into the past for one of the most famous water-related cases on record, Shag Harbor. SplashDown is brought to you today by Cardiac Roast Coffee Company. We go deeper than your average bean. Whether you're up till 2 a.m. cross-referencing sonar logs or just trying to survive a Monday, Cardiac Roast has a blend for that. Use code SplashDown for absolutely nothing, because we made all this up. But seriously, go make yourself a coffee and pay attention. I know my voice still sucks, but this is good USO information. Stay with me. So many episodes, and we've never had a real sponsor, and I don't think we're starting today. Don't really want one. Okay, we're back. Shag Harbor. Where even is that? It is a tiny fishing village, southern tip of Nova Scotia, Canada, right on the Atlantic coast. And the reason this one matters so much in USO circles is that it might be the single best documented case of an object entering the water that we have on record. Not because there's footage. There isn't, it's 1967, but because of the sheer paper trail it left behind. October 4th, 1967, around 11:20 at night, Atlantic time. A young local named Lori Wickens is driving with some friends and they see something. a low-flying object with what most witnesses describe as 4 bright lights flashing in sequence, moving across the sky, and then angling down toward the water at roughly a 45-degree dive. And it's not just these kids who see it. Not even close. This is the part that makes it credible. At least 11 separate witnesses that night, including, depending on the account, off-duty RCMP officers, fishermen, and reportedly airline pilots in the area. And there's a sequence of sound that nearly everybody describes the same way, a whistling noise, like a falling bomb, then a whoosh, then a loud bang. That's a very specific, very consistent description for a dozen unrelated people to land on independently. That's exactly the detail that gets researchers' attention. When you've got people who don't know each other describing the same 3-part sound sequence, that's not typically what emerges from a shared hallucination or a coordinated hoax. And it wasn't even just Shag Harbor that night. Earlier that same evening, a commercial flight, Air Canada Flight 305, flying from Halifax toward Toronto, had its own crew report something unusual off the side of the aircraft while cruising at altitude over Quebec, hours before and hundreds of miles from Shag Harbor. Separately, callers flooded newsrooms and radio stations in Halifax around 10 that night describing glowing objects in the sky there too. None of that proves the Halifax area sightings and the Shag Harbor object were the same thing, but it paints a picture of a genuinely active night across the whole region, not an isolated event in one fishing village. So Wickens calls it in. He thinks it's a plane crash, understandably, and reports it to the RCMP. They didn't believe him at first, basically hung up, then called back once more reports started rolling in from elsewhere along the coast. Multiple agencies get pulled in almost immediately. The RCMP, the Canadian Coast Guard, both the Navy and Air Force branches of the Canadian Forces, and even the American Condon Committee, which at the time was the U.S. government's own official, congressionally requested study into UFO reports broadly, run out of the University of Colorado. NORAD radar stations in the region were even checked for a corresponding track. Why would an American committee even care about a Canadian case? Because Shag Harbor was considered significant enough, with this many corroborating witnesses and a multi-agency Canadian military response, that it crossed the border as a case worth paying attention to. It's one of the relatively few non-US incidents that got that kind of cross-border interest at the time. And then the search begins. Almost immediately, boats go out that same night looking for survivors of what everyone assumes is a downed aircraft. What they find is a patch of yellow foam on the surface of the water. That's essentially it. No bodies, no wreckage, no debris field, nothing matching any registered aircraft known to be in the area. For several days afterward, something like a dozen boats are out there, divers going down repeatedly, and Canadian Forces personnel from a nearby airbase got pulled into the search directly. And no plane was actually missing. And that's the detail that flips this from tragic plane crash into officially unidentified. Aviation authorities checked. And there was no civilian or military aircraft unaccounted for anywhere near that coastline that night. Whatever went into the water at Shag Harbor was never matched to anything that was supposed to have been flying. I've also seen claims that something was tracked moving underwater for 20-some miles afterward. This is where I want to flag the difference between the well-documented core of the case and the parts that have grown in the retelling over nearly 60 years. Some later accounts claim Navy assets tracked something moving underwater from the harbor, roughly 25 miles, to a place called Government Point. I'll be straightforward. That specific detail is far less solidly sourced than the original 11-witness sighting and the official multi-agency search. It shows up in some retrospective write-ups, but I haven't seen it tied to a primary document the way the rest of the case is. Take that particular detail with a heavier grain of salt than everything else here, because that's honestly the whole problem with this field. The original event can be genuinely well documented, and then decades of retelling layer in detail that may or may not actually exist in the record. I'd rather be the podcast that tells you which parts to trust more, instead of smashing it all together because the bigger version makes for a better headline. There's a well-regarded book on this case, called Dark Object, co-written by researcher Chris Stiles and writer Don Ledger, That goes through the original case files in a lot more detail than we can cover in one podcast, if you want the deep version. And the case has actually been revisited with modern equipment too. Not just left alone since '67. There have been follow-up sonar surveys of the harbor bottom over the decades since, by various independent researchers, and as far as I know, none of them have turned up anything publicly confirmed as wreckage, which either means whatever it was moved on, like that 25-mile claim suggests, or it means there genuinely wasn't a solid object left behind to find, or it means it's still down there, and nobody's looked in exactly the right spot with the right equipment yet. The official status of the case today? Still unidentified. Canadian authorities never closed it with an explanation. It's on the books as an unexplained event. The town's built a whole identity around it. There's a Shag Harbor Incident Society, a museum, and an annual UFO festival, and locals will absolutely talk your ear off about it if you visit. Back in 2018, around the 51st anniversary, Céline and Fabien Cousteau, grandchildren of the ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau, announced they were heading to Shag Harbor to investigate the incident themselves. When a family that's spent generations being the gold standard of ocean exploration says, "Yeah, we want to go look at this one," that tells you the story has staying power well beyond just UFO enthusiasts. This might be my favorite case in the whole USO catalog, honestly, because it's old enough that there's no slick video for people to argue pixel by pixel about, and yet it's still got 11+ credible witnesses, multiple government agencies, and a permanent, "we genuinely don't know," stamped on it by Canada's own institutions. I don't need it to be aliens for it to be one of the better pieces of evidence we have that something occasionally enters our oceans that we cannot explain. This is one of the cases where even my more cautious brain doesn't have a great mundane explanation sitting around waiting. All right, next stop, the Baltic Sea, between Sweden and Finland, summer of 2011. This is the one with the famous sonar image, the circle that looks kind of like a parked spacecraft on the seabed. There's a Swedish dive and salvage outfit called Ocean X, run by two guys, Peter Lindberg and Dennis Asperg. They're not UFO researchers, for what it's worth, they're professional treasure hunters, looking for old shipwrecks and valuable cargo. June 2011, they're doing a sonar sweep of the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern arm of the Baltic, and on what was supposed to be basically their last pass before heading home, the sonar fish picks up something nobody was expecting. A close-to-perfect circle, roughly 60 meters across, sitting around 90 meters down, with raised edges, some kind of stepped or ramp-like feature, and a long, straight ridge trailing off behind it for a few hundred meters, almost like something had skidded into place. Lindbergh's own description was that it was blurry but interesting, classic understatement from a guy who spent his career staring at sonar returns of actual shipwrecks and had apparently never seen anything shaped quite like this. And this is where it goes from, weird, to international headlines. The image leaks, tabloids grab it, and within days you've got stories calling it a sunken UFO, comparisons to a famous fictional spaceship from the movies, theories that it's a secret World War II installation, theories it's the lost city of Atlantis. Lindbergh himself floated the Atlantis idea publicly at one point. To be clear, that's his own speculation, not anything confirmed. So naturally, they go back to actually look at it. In the summer of 2012, they send divers down with better gear, and what they describe finding is honestly stranger than the original sonar blob. They say the structure rises 3 to 4 meters off the seafloor, shaped like a mushroom or a dome, with rounded sides, and at the top, an opening one diver called egg-shaped, leading into the structure, surrounded by what looked like circular stone arrangements, almost like small fire pits, covered in a dark, sooty residue. And then there's what I think is the creepiest detail in the whole story. One of the divers, Stefan Hogeborn, who'd logged something like 6,000 dives over a 20-year career, said that whenever they were positioned directly above the object, their electronics would simply stop working. Satellite phones, cameras, dead, then fine again the moment they moved off it. That's the kind of detail that either points to something genuinely strange or means somebody's gear was already glitchy and the story grew a little in the telling. I'll be honest, I don't know which. Geologists who have examined the data say the most likely explanation is a natural formation, shaped by glacial activity from the last ice age. That part of the Baltic seabed has a lot of unusual deposits from glacial movement, and too symmetrical to be natural, turns out to be a less reliable instinct than people assume, because nature genuinely does produce surprisingly regular shapes under the right pressure and erosion conditions over thousands of years. Some pointed to World War II-era anti-submarine net anchors or old naval debris, since that part of the Baltic saw real military activity last century, though nobody's matched the shape or size to any known wartime hardware. Others point to something called a pockmark. That's an actual recognized seafloor phenomenon where gas escaping from underground deposits creates circular depressions or mounds on the seabed, sometimes startlingly geometric-looking. The problem is pockmarks are usually associated with specific gas-rich geology, and nobody's confirmed that's present at this exact site either. So even the boring explanations don't have a perfect fit, which I think is actually the most honest way to summarize this whole case. The natural explanation is the most probable one statistically, but most probable isn't the same as fully confirmed and matched to a known process. Nobody's walked away from this one with a clean, unambiguous geology report. Over the years, Lindbergh has been pretty consistent that he doesn't personally buy the simple glacial boulder explanation, partly because, in his words, professional divers and sonar operators who have spent careers around shipwrecks and seabed terrain don't typically come away calling an ordinary rock formation the strangest thing they've ever found. He's also been careful not to claim it's definitely artificial or extraterrestrial. His consistent position has basically been, I don't know, and I don't think the easy answer fully fits either, which is honestly a pretty reasonable place to land, even all these years later. And for scale on how big this got culturally, a documentary crew came out. Several international news outlets ran features on it, and online, people couldn't stop comparing the sonar shape to a famous fictional spaceship from the movies, which probably did more to cement flying saucer in the public imagination than any of the actual scientific back and forth. The internet's pattern-matching instinct is a hell of a drug. So, unresolved, leaning natural, with a pretty significant asterisk, which honestly describes about 60% of the stories in our show. Before we surface for our last case, a quick bonus round. There's a story that isn't a USO case in the alien craft sense, but it fits our "the ocean hides things" theme too well to skip. The USS Stein Navy frigate, out in the Pacific, sometime in the mid to late 70s, sources actually disagree on whether it's 76 or 78, which tells you something about how a story can blur even when it's a Navy ship. The ship comes back from deployment, and they find the rubber coating on its sonar dome. That's the big dome on the underside of the hull, just shredded. Something like 8% of the surface torn up, gouges reportedly up to 4 feet long, which looked like claw marks. When a Navy biologist named FG would examine the damage, he found curved hook fragments still embedded in the rubber, consistent with the kind found on the suction cups of squid tentacles, except scaled up well beyond anything on record for the era. Something attacked a warship. That's the working theory, almost certainly a very large squid, possibly a colossal squid, which is a real species that genuinely gets enormous. This isn't cryptid nonsense. The wilder corners of the internet have claimed the attacker could have been up to 150 feet long, which is almost certainly exaggerated. Actual colossal squid top out somewhere around 20 to 25 feet. But even the conservative version of the story is still, something large enough to physically damage a warship's hull was down there, and it was never identified down to species. Which, again, ties right back to our interlude earlier. Recovery and identification at depth is genuinely hard, even for the U.S. Navy with all its resources. I love that story because it's proof you don't even need aliens for the ocean to be unsettling. Speaking of stories that have grown a lot in the telling, I'll tell you about the Lake Baikal one, purely as a "have you heard this?" rather than a verified case. Heavy caveat. The story that circulated for years is that Soviet military divers training in Lake Baikal back in 1982 encountered humanoid figures in tight silver suits at depth. that some divers pursued them and didn't make it back the way they went down, and that the whole thing got buried by the military. I want to be clear, I've never seen this traced to a named, dated primary source, the kind of paper trail we just spent 10 minutes praising Shag Harbor for having. It's the kind of story that shows up in compilation lists and documentaries citing each other in a loop. So why bring it up at all? Because I think it's worth knowing the difference between documented mystery and campfire story. And this one is firmly the second category. There's also an old maritime legend off the coast of Japan, sometimes called the Devil's Sea, with the same Bermuda Triangle-style reputation for unexplained disappearances. Same deal, fun, atmospheric, thin on hard documentation the further back you trace it. All right, let's go back up into the sky for a minute, because you genuinely cannot do a USO episode without at least one stop at the most famous UAP case there is. It's November 2004. The USS Nimitz carrier group is running training exercises off San Diego. For about 2 weeks before anything visual happens, the cruiser in that group, the Princeton is tracking, on Sirius calibrated radar, objects dropping from somewhere around 80,000 feet down to near sea level in a matter of seconds. That's not a speed a crewed aircraft survives. And eventually somebody gets sent to actually look. November 14th, a pair of F-18s get vectored out, and the lead pilot, Commander David Fravor, along with his weapons officer, describes a smooth white object. No wings, no rotors, no visible exhaust, roughly 40 feet long, about the shape of a tic-tac mint, hence the name, moving erratically above a patch of disturbed foamy white water on the ocean's surface below it. Multiple witnesses described that whitewater patch like something large had been sitting at or near the surface, stirring it up, before this object appeared hovering above it. As Fravor's jet closes in, the object reacts almost instantly to his approach and accelerates away faster than anything in the U.S. inventory at the time. A separate jet on the same mission, flown by Chad Underwood, later captured the infrared footage that eventually became public. And this became one of the actual Pentagon-confirmed videos. Part of the trio, the Pentagon officially confirmed as real, unedited Navy footage, when this story finally broke into the mainstream around 2017, with a lot of credit to a former Senate staffer named Chris Mellon for helping push the videos toward release. It's probably the single most credentialed UAP sighting on record. Career Navy fighter pilots, calibrated military radar, corroborating witnesses across different platforms, official confirmation that the footage is genuine, and sworn congressional testimony years later. There's also a related pair of incidents from 2015, off the Theodore Roosevelt that produced the other two confirmed videos, Gimbal and Go Fast, different deployment, often grouped into the same conversation. A Navy pilot named Ryan Graves, who flew during that 2015 period, later testified to Congress about near-daily encounters his squadron had off the Virginia coast. That detail doesn't get enough attention, honestly. If it's a recurring, near-daily thing for an entire squadron over an extended deployment, that's a different category of mystery than one dramatic afternoon happening to a single pilot. And why I tie this one back to USOs specifically is that whitewater detail. If something large enough to disturb the ocean's surface that was sitting right at the air boundary before this object appeared above it, that's basically the same transmedium question we've been asking all episode, just viewed from the air looking down, instead of a ship's sensor looking out. I don't think it's a coincidence that almost every time people seriously dig into best UAP case and best USO case, the ocean ends up sitting right in the middle of both stories. Okay, tallying it up. A Navy ship that filmed something descending into the Pacific with no splash and got an actual Pentagon confirmation. A Nova Scotia fishing village with 11+ witnesses and a 60-year-old open case. A circular structure on the Baltic seabed that even the guy who found it still calls the strangest thing of his career. And a sonar dome clawed up by something the Navy's own biologist couldn't fully identify. I'll say plainly where I personally stand on today's stories. I think there's something real happening in and under our oceans that we don't currently have a complete explanation for. I'm not going to tell you it's confirmed non-human intelligence, because nobody, not the Navy, not Aero, Not even Trump's own executive order has said that. But we don't know. Stacked up across this many independently credible cases tips me toward, as Fox Mulder says, I want to believe. My one closing thought, keep the receipts straight. Shag Harbor's 11 witnesses and a multi-agency search file is a different tier of evidence than the Lake Baikal story we tossed in as a caveat-heavy aside. Both are fun. They are not equally solid. And I think holding on to that distinction is exactly what keeps this topic worth taking seriously, instead of letting it all collapse into one big tabloid blob. That's our show. If you want to dig into any of this yourself, the Shag Harbor case has its own museum and incident society you can look up. AARO's public reports are genuinely posted online if you want the primary source material. And the Omaha footage is out there if you want to watch it and form your own opinion. Richard Dolan, a UAP, USO author with many books out there, created an intense USO case spreadsheet that I'll link in the comment section. Check it out. You will be surprised how many cases there are. Until next time, be kind, be fair, and be aware.